Well, a new year, new laws enacted, some of them controversial. But will they prove too controversial in an election year? Michael Geoghegan, a political consultant based in Victoria, BC, joins us now to talk about this. Michael, let's start with the right to die debate, because that is one that's back in the spotlight. Quebec kind of making its own rules, a Supreme Court decision coming down as well. Is this one you think that Ottawa might leave to the provinces to handle so they can sidestep a controversy?
Well, I would certainly advise that they do that. As you mentioned, the Supreme Court is looking at some of the existing legislation, seeing whether or not provisions that criminalize any kind of assistance with regards to dying when people are at the end of their lives, seeing whether or not that violates the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Quebec has already gone forward with its own legislation. Certainly, it's an issue in our aging population that's becoming of more significant political importance. So I think many of these situations are unique. All of them are full of emotion, and thus I think it bears some caution on the behalf of the federal government and perhaps letting the province take a bit of a lead.
The charter violation idea, then the feds would have to pick it up, I guess, at some point, whether they like it or not. And quite often we see the Supreme Court give them a deadline of when they have to deal with it, usually a year, yes?
Yeah, that's typically what's happened. That's what's happened with regards to the prostitution laws. And as we've seen with the prostitution laws, sometimes the ruling or the indication that the court gives doesn't mean that that's the direction that the government's going to respond in terms of the legislation they come back with. So it'll be very interesting to see if a ruling does come out, how the federal government responds.
Let's talk about the prostitution legislation, because it is now in effect. It did have, as you mentioned, that year deadline. Ottawa had a year deadline to get something together. Does it go far enough, I'm going to ask you to look at it politically, for the Conservative base, or is this something that could prove controversial moving towards the fall?
I think it goes far enough in terms of the Conservative base. The legislation makes it illegal to purchase sexual services, so it does that. It still, in essence, criminalizes that transaction. Where, of course, the controversy comes in is for those that say it's still for people who choose to make their living doing this, that it still keeps them in on the margins of society, underground, and therefore more open to exploitation. On the other hand, there are those that they want to bring an end to sex trafficking and exploitation, particularly of women and the underage in this area. So I suspect that is legislation that is definitely going to end up back in court.
What about skilled workers? That's also been very controversial for Ottawa. They've tried to make some moves to sort of correct the situation, but you can say that everybody has a gripe with it at this point. How do you think that's going to play out this year?
Well, certainly, the stepping back in terms of the temporary foreign worker program, they no longer made it eligible. That was because there was some pushback from Canadians in general, as well as the Conservative base, like saying, hey, my kid wants to work at McDonald's and they can't get a job because they brought in all these temporary foreign workers. There's other people who are like, yeah, there's good paying jobs in the oil patch, or at least there were before oil prices started falling. And it's a situation where, what are you talking about, that these resource sector jobs are being outsourced? And I think I think amongst Canadians, there's certainly a sense that if we're going to have resource development, there's an environmental cost with that there should be good paying jobs and that they should be going to Canadians. That having been said, there's certainly issues with regards to skilled trade shortages. And one way of addressing that is what the federal government has done, where they've, in terms of the 3 programs where people have certain specific trades, where they have job offers, which is going to make it easier for them to get residency status. So I think that represents a good balance, because a lot of Canadians are saying, look, if we need to import skilled people, it shouldn't be on a temporary basis. They should be allowed to come here and become Canadians, and thus, Canadian values, Canadian labor standards, Canadian wages, and the like.
All right, Michael Geoghegan, a political consultant based out of Victoria, BC. Thanks for joining us today, Michael.
Thank you.